Hello and welcome to Subject to Change with me, Russell Hogg. My guest today is Pulitzer Prize winner Stacy Schiff. Stacy is a writer of biographies and other works, and when her books aren't being awarded Pulitzer Prizes, they are either being nominated for them or they're winning any number of other literary awards. Her subjects include Vera Nabokov, Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, and Cleopatra. Her most recent book is The Revolutionary, about Samuel Adams, but today she's very kindly agreed to come on the show to talk about her book, The Witches, which is a history of the Salem Witch trials of 1692. Anyway, welcome, Stacy, to the podcast.
Delighted to join you, Russell.
One way to approach this might be to work our way through from the beginning to the end, but I wanted to start off somewhere in the middle so that our listeners could get some idea of what was at stake for the accused. So could you maybe explain what happens to Giles Corey? And I think that was sometime in mid-September of 1692.
That's really going for the jugular, isn't it, to start with Giles Corey? Giles Corey was a very cantankerous 70-ish year old man who actually is, I think, the first man to be accused. He's accused in the spring. And he won't be brought into the courtroom until September, when he proves true to his reputation as a very ornery character by refusing to comply with the court. And here's what he does. And I should say that his wife had earlier been accused and is at this moment herself imprisoned on witchcraft charges. In the 1690s, a court could not proceed without you agreeing to be tried by God and my country, as the expression went. And when Giles Corey was called upon to utter those 5 words, which he had uttered before in other trials, because he had been in and out of court fairly frequently over the years, he refused. And he could not be convinced by any number of people to utter the words. And so he was first threatened with and then actually sentenced to a punishment that was never before used in the colonies, had only been threatened to be used, and which was never used again, which was the sentence of peine forte et dure, which was basically having stones and weights piled atop a plank upon your body until you either relented and gave the court what they needed, or until you perished. And it was a punishment that was, as often things were as often things are in law, very specifically codified. It was said that you were to have no sustenance at first on the first day, and then 3 morsels of rotten bread the next day, and then 3 draughts of standing water, but the water had to be the water nearest the prison door after that. And essentially the understanding is that you would obviously relent, which Giles Corey did not do. And in the course of this horrific ordeal, I might add, he is also being excommunicated. Although since he can't be charged with witchcraft because he can't be tried, he's excommunicated from the church during those horrific days as a suicide.
It's extraordinary. This man in his 80s is able to hold out like this. Cantankerous hardly seems to be the word for him somehow.
You know, he'd been in and out of court, as I said. He was responsible for any number of thefts. He actually at one point had threatened suicide. He'd threatened to burn a neighbor's barn. But he also seemed to have a sort of jocular side. He had come to terms with and was on good terms, in good standing with one of the other key players that year. So he was someone who clearly was willing to stand his ground and had a certain amount of respect within the community.
I sort of wanted to start with Giles Corey being pressed like that because it's so easy to get into the weeds of the Salem trials and maybe miss, the sheer physical violence of it all. And I don't know why, but somehow, what happened to Giles Corey almost feels more horrific than the hangings. And I feel like we're in the Middle Ages somehow.
Mm-hmm.
But 1692, it's not the Middle Ages anymore. I mean, Galileo's long gone. Newton he's written his Principia. So are we in the modern world at this stage or not?
Well, first of all, to your point, I think it does speak very much to that season, those 9 or 10 crazed months, in that so much of this is essentially stubbornness. So much of this on both sides is people unwilling to part from a received notion. But yes, we are on our way. We are hurtling elsewhere in the world toward the Enlightenment, but not so much in 17th century Massachusetts. And that is in part the work of the of the clergy. The New England ministry has done an exceptionally good job at seeing to it that, for example, books which express doubts about witchcraft do not penetrate the Massachusetts Bay Colony, so that you could read plenty of skeptical literature about witch trials and witchcraft at that time, but you could not read those books for the most part in Massachusetts. And that does obviously contribute to what happens that year. There have been hundreds of years of witch prosecutions over internationally. Those have all finished when New England's takes off.
Right. And I guess, okay, so I've sort of started us in the middle and confused everybody. So maybe we should go back to the start. And
well, you got everyone's attention, that's for sure.
Yeah, we start with a bang. So, but do you want to sort of give the listeners and maybe people on my side of in the UK, they might be less familiar with what happened in Salem than the Americans. I don't know how familiar people are, but could you just sort of give an overview of what happened in the witch trials, and then we can go into some of the details?
Sure. So at the end of an extremely cold and very long winter, sometime in January, early February of 1692, two little girls begin to convulse and fall into trances and shriek and scream and find their limbs pretzeled into strange postures, interrupt sermons, creep under tables, and hurl themselves down wells. And those two little girls, who are 9 and 11, are the daughter and the niece of a Salem village minister named Samuel Parris. Salem Village, I should say, is a town of 550 people. It's on the outskirts of a larger, wealthier town, which is the town in which all of the administrative offices for Salem Village are located. So it's essentially a town that can't, in many ways, administer justice itself. It has to look to the town for guidance on most issues, and is therefore sort of satellite settlement to the town of Salem. No one jumps to any immediate conclusions, although fairly recently, a few years earlier, there had been a much written about and very similar incident in which a group of Boston children had suffered identical symptoms. And in the case of the Boston children, fingers pointed very quickly to a woman in Boston who was hanged on Boston Common for witchcraft. So fairly soon after the first diagnoses are made, the diagnosis of witchcraft comes to the fore in 1692. And as soon as the girls are essentially told that they are suffering from some kind of sorcery, obviously names begin to be named. And at first they will name three women, pretty much the three marginal characters, or at least two of them are marginal characters. One is a more interesting choice. And from there, everything will essentially begin to snowball. At first, three people are named. At first, two girls are suffering. And very soon, other girls begin to suffer the same symptoms, and more fingers begin to be pointed. And I don't know if you want me to chart the progress of what happens, but essentially you get this kind of juggernaut over the next 9 months, during which essentially the epidemic spreads to nearly 25 other Massachusetts towns.
One of the things that it never ceased to amaze me all the way through the book was how lacking in any sort of skeptical view the court was that was looking at this. And these three people that you mentioned who were brought in, was one of these Tituba, because it felt like it was her story that somehow gave this thing wings in some way.
I think that's exactly right. The first two women who are named, the first two suspects, are outliers in the community. One is a sort of itinerant beggar woman. The other is an older woman who has actually she's hauled out of her sickbed, in fact, to be accused, but she's been difficult and she's been litigious in the past. And the third is an enslaved woman who lives with the Parrises. By all accounts, at the time, she's Indian, although modern commentators have turned her into a black slave. But she seems to have been Indian, and possibly Indian from the Caribbean. And Tituba gives the examiners not just the story they're looking for, but a story of just kaleidoscopic detail, and starts talking about yellow birds and black cats and diabolical packs and people flying through the air. I mean, she really just gives the story all of its color and detail, and it's extraordinarily lush confession. Not what something that the court clearly was expecting, because there are several men on hand to take down her testimony, but the detail of it is so precise and so completely out of keeping with anything I think anyone could possibly have imagined. She's speaking with an accent. We have her testimony as it was written down. She's speaking with an accent, and she's speaking in just whole. I mean, she must have been a champion storyteller. She's just speaking in almost whole chapters, really, when she gives this testimony. But with that testimony, she has essentially acknowledged that there is witchcraft at work. And that is exactly why things suddenly take off with the speed with which they take off. And there are a couple of other sort of inflection points like that. But once Tituba has testified, it's almost impossible for someone like Martha Corey, who was hauled in immediately after, to deny the existence of witchcraft because the court has heard that witchcraft is indeed present in the community.
And can you just say a bit about the court? There seemed to be two courts. There was one where they were charged and then one where they were tried. I don't know if I've got that right. And I think the one they're tried, it's presided over a man called Stoughton.
You have that exactly right. There are depositions which are taken by justices of the peace, and then by summer, a full court will be seated, which we refer to generally as the witchcraft court, which is made up of 9 justices. And I suppose the first thing that needs to be said is, startling though this sounds, none of these men is a lawyer, for the simple reason that there were no lawyers yet in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And there's actually a hilarious letter written back to England at one point, basically saying, could you send us a few honest lawyers if such a thing exists in nature? But yes, there's, on the one hand, tremendous familiarity. These are very literate people, and that's actually literate and literal people. There's great familiarity with the law and how the law should be and has been exercised. But these men are not trained lawyers. Not that anything would have fallen out differently, because witchcraft was the second most potent transgression in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and these people are being tried for idolatry was the first, and witchcraft was the second crime one could commit. So the court is, in fact, acting for the most part in good faith and according to the law.
And so who is Stoughton, and how does he come to be in charge of the court, and what kind of guy is he?
So Stoughton, and you're on the right track here in terms of whom we should be attending to. Stoughton is the chief of the witchcraft court. He's the chief justice of the 9 men who were seated. These men are, most of them, familiar with each other. They either hold minor civic posts, or they are wealthy merchants. Many of them went to school together. Several of them are married to each other's relatives. So it's sort of a monolithic group on this court. Stoughton has been for years the sort of go-to person if you had a question of law. He's very well versed in the law. He's extremely good at adjudicating all kinds of cases. He has also been a sort of political survivor. There have been a lot of convulsions in Massachusetts politics in the years prior to 1692. And Stoughton has found himself several times on the wrong side and has managed to sort of re-ingratiate himself with the right side. So he's a little bit of a political survivor. And, this is conjectural, but that may have something to do with why he takes such a dogged and dogmatic stance in 1692. He's obviously trying to prove something here. But he's definitely a man whom everyone looks up to, and in whose presence almost everyone who was dragged into that room would have felt faint, because he is a sort of commanding figure from all accounts. He's also, interestingly, by the way, lifelong bachelor. So the fact that he has to deal with these terrorized and shrieking girls, I think, is kind of interesting, because I don't think that was something that was in his experience.
And he's a very intelligent man, though, isn't he? He's probably one of the brightest men, with maybe the exception of one or two of the ministers. He's probably one of the brightest men in the colony.
Yes, and that's why I say well versed in the law, immensely erudite, for the most part, respected throughout, and certainly the person you would go to unravel any kind of legal riddle you might have.
And yet he allows his courtroom to sort of degenerate into this. I mean, there was the trial of Rebecca Nurse. So do you want to just say how that proceeds?
Sure.
and ends and then ends again?
That's really what I think, probably the most fascinating one. And I should just say, to your question about Stoughton, one of the mysteries that year obviously is what afflicted these girls, what sent these girls into these paroxysms. But the greater mystery is, why does the court proceed as it does? Why this aggressive need to convict? And Stoughton is unstoppable. I mean, he's told at one point to disband the court, and he doesn't, and he refuses to do so. He's on a mission of some kind. So some of the mystery of that year, obviously, is indeed what's motivating Stoughton, who leaves an unsatisfying record behind, I might add. Rebecca Nurse is a much older farm woman from a large family. She's an unusual person to have been accused, and we don't know precisely why she's accused. There are all kinds of reasons she may have been accused. It may have had nothing to do with anything except the fact that she was the mother of 8 healthy children and in a very close family where there was no particular dysfunction. Everyone was on good terms with each other. Her good fortune may have been held against her. She may have been named because her family had been involved in a land dispute decades earlier. It's unclear. But Rebecca Nurse, who's an elderly woman, very hard of hearing and somewhat frail, is hauled into court on witchcraft charges. Hers is the only case in which a husband not only fails to say, "Oh, yes, I always thought my wife was a witch," of which there are several cases, but actually actively tries to send documents to the court signed by other villagers in her defense. So there's an attempt made at mounting a defense for Rebecca Nurse. The jury will hear her case and return a verdict of not guilty. And Stoughton is unhappy with that verdict, and as was his right, he asks the jury if they should perhaps reconsider. And so they invite some more testimony. They hear that testimony, they go back and they redeliberate. In the course of that testimony, Rebecca Nurse says something along the lines of about one of the other women as she's one of us, probably meaning she was in prison with me. But that was heard, as Stoughton points out, or Stoughton likes to interpret that as, we were in league together as confederates of the devil, and the jurors will ultimately deliver a guilty verdict. The Nurse family, again, alone among families, takes that verdict to higher officials in Boston and manages to arrange for a reprieve for Rebecca Nurse. And Stoughton will somehow manage behind the scenes to see to it that reprieve is annulled. So Rebecca Nurse, in fact, will hang, but hers is the only case where there had twice been this moment of reprieve.
And you say we don't quite know why she's accused, and yet you've got these girls who we don't know what afflicts them. We don't know if they're lying. We don't know if there's some sort of a hysteria or whatever the word is. But you're sort of implying that underneath this, there's something more logical. There's some grudges from the past, something of that sort that may be bubbling up through. Can you sort of explain the two threads here?
One of the mysteries of that year is why the girls name the names they do. And in some cases, as I said initially, if you had to name 2 names in Salem Village, you probably would have come up with those first 2 names. They were the marginal characters. They were the first people you would vote off the island. In the end, the girls are naming names of people they've never met. Very often they're naming names of people they've never met. And then the question becomes, is someone suggesting these names to them? They clearly know these people only by reputation. Very often they name names of people who are particularly prominent for one reason or another. Either there's been a crime in their family, or they've been tremendously successful, or in one case there's a man who's named who's famous for trading with the Indians, and this is during a time of a lot of Indian wars. So obviously that would have been seen in some sort of dubious light. So the question is, are someone suggesting names to the girls? How exactly are they coming up with these names? The problem is that really what you would need to see is something that never makes its way onto paper, which is the swirl of rumor that probably lies behind much of the accusations. These are families who had very often been involved in court cases against each other years earlier, and then these are families who had nothing to do one with the other, and they can fall into both categories. We don't have, when you mentioned the fact that there are 2 courts, we have the depositions, which are the early accounts. We don't have the papers from the actual trials, which in fact may have been very formulaic. There may not have been any great detail there. But what we do have are the court papers from the decades prior to 1692, the records and files of the quarterly courts of Essex County. And if you read through those pages, which are utterly fascinating, you see an enormous amount of just the daily grit and, grievance about borders and livestock and, people who made off with other people's money and people who cheated other people at business deals and people who farmed land that wasn't their own and people who didn't respect that the stump at the corner was the edge of their property. And you see a lot of collisions, some of which will show up in court in 1692. So that explains perhaps a bit of it. And Rebecca Nurse is possibly involved in one of those if was indeed a dispute over a piece of land. She and two of her sisters are all accused of witchcraft. In other cases, there are several of the women who are named that year had been accused in the past or suspected in the past of witchcraft. So there does seem to be, the girls may have been familiar with these names because these people had a sort of taint about them to begin. And in other cases, it's one of the wealthiest men in Salem town is named. Was he named because he was a French Protestant and wealthy, or was he named because he had done harm to someone? It's unclear to us. It's very hard to sort of in any way analyze the logic behind it. But everyone has a grievance with a neighbor, is my theory.
It's odd, isn't it? This fantastically religious community, and yet everybody's at war with everybody else.
You see that particularly when you see the exchanges between ministers and their congregations about their salaries, because of course, yes, this is a deeply pious community, but no one wants to pay the minister. And so in communities throughout New England, you have these collisions over who's going to supply the minister's firewood and whether the minister must be ordained, because in ordaining a minister, you essentially granted him the land on which he was living, which was a huge concession. So there's always this back and forth, even with the men the community should be most respectful of as to whether they will settle these ministers within the community's bounds.
It's quite ironic, isn't it? There's no lawyers in the community, but there's no shortage of legal disputes.
Yeah, I don't know if you can say that if there's cause and effect. I mean, there is an interesting insistence on causation, which may have something to do with Puritan thinking, Puritan dogma as well. Everyone's watching each other very, very closely and ascribing cause and effect very quickly. But we should also add to that the fact that this is a part of the world that felt itself in those years very much under siege. So economically under siege.
Well, you say they felt they were under siege, but they were under siege, weren't they?
Yes, in the sense that there has been an extremely violent Indian war, and they're about to be engaged in another. Everyone knows someone who has either lost a family member, who has been mutilated in some way in prior conflicts with the Indians. There's also a great deal of political unrest. It's also, as I said, it's a particularly severe winter, and there's an enormous amount of strife within the household of Samuel Parris between minister and community, which the girls could not have been insensitive to.
Another thing that struck me was how the court, they seem to treat people who confess, who buy into the story, they treat them much more leniently than the ones who continued to deny the story, that refused to confess to being witches. It seems, completely turned again upside down in a way.
That's one of the exceptional parts of this year. There are several ways in which 1692 doesn't fit with prior witchcraft cases or outbreaks, and that's one of them. That the confessors are sent back to prison; they never are sent to hang. And part of that was, first of all, you can imagine what the effect of that was. Once you realized that if you confessed, you were likely to live, there was a run on confession, and inside every one of those confessions, naturally, was a pointed finger at someone else. So it was almost always a smart ploy, but it also meant that you were actually probably going to have to name someone else. And that has something to do with the velocity, certainly, with which the accusations continue to pile up. And then you have a lot of people who have confessed to witchcraft, possibly to save their lives, in prison together, and then discussing, obviously, what they're going to tell the court. So then the narrative itself begins to cohere quite a bit more by late in the summer, when you have a lot of people who are clearly living within inches of each other for long periods of time in a filthy prison, and they're comparing notes, obviously, on what they think they need to tell the court to stay alive.
I'm amazed they got room for them in this prison, because presumably they must have had, I don't know how many people would have been in that prison at any one time once the witchcraft trials really took off.
They end up carting people from prison to prison for precisely that reason. Prisons in New England were not built to hold prisoners for any period of time. There was never a sense that you were actually going to have to hold someone. So they tended to be rather shoddy buildings. The locks were very often picked. Often the walls blew down on prisons in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And here you have a tremendous number of people who are obviously going to be incarcerated at the same time. One of the more horrific documents we have, the convention at the time was you paid for your own bedding and food when you were in prison. And so we have the jail keeps records of how much he was charging each prisoner, each prisoner's family, for his or her straw and food, even for the shackles with which your hands were shackled.
Did they have fires? Were they kept warm? It sounds just almost, well, I suppose into summer it matters less, but
I think yes, Arctic in winter and stifling in summer were exactly the conditions. I think they were horrific. And I think it's 5 people who die in prison. So some people didn't make it out of prison, and many people who finally emerge later, who are not tried, find that their health is compromised for the rest of their lives from those months.
can we just say, what exactly is a witch under their understanding? I mean, how does anyone know that they exist? What are they basing that on?
I'm trying to think what it is today that we might believe in with the conviction with which a 17th century New Englander believed in witchcraft. But essentially, a witch was an individual who had basically made a compact with the devil, and who had, in his or her employ, imps of some kind who helped him or her to assist the devil in this diabolical pact. The New England witch is very much the Anglo-Saxon witch, which is to say there had not, prior to Salem, ever been flying witches. That was a continental idea, as was the idea of a witch's Sabbath, which is new to New England in 1692. That had not happened before. Suddenly, by the end of the summer, you get everyone describing this extraordinary diabolical Sabbath with sacraments of, various kinds, which seems to have been imported from some literature that one of the ministers had published. But you did have this idea of a pact with the devil that you signed, and this idea that you had these little animal spirits that did your bidding. That comes very much from the sort of Anglo-Saxon conception of a witch. And as I say, this was part of the criminal code. The feeling was that witchcraft was as obvious as was heat or light. It was just one of the laws of nature. And that in its defense, since all societies seem to subscribe to the belief, how could anything be so widespread if it weren't true? And more to the point, how could anything so preposterous possibly be so widespread if it weren't true? How could every civilization have thought of the same idea? So it just, at this moment, is really a fixed given. And what's interesting about the end of the trials is that people will believe that the justices have misstepped. They will believe that innocents have hanged, but they still believe in witchcraft. And very often someone who is imprisoned on what she thinks are false charges believes herself innocent, but believes the person next to her may be guilty.
When I look at the translations in the Bible, this thing, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. So I thought, well, I'll look this up and see what it says in the new, the more user-friendly versions, and see if it, how does it deal with it? And I found about, 20 different versions of the Bible. And most of them say something like, you must put a sorceress to death. And there's an implication in these translations that witches are female. But in the Salem trials, I can't remember, is it something like 2/3 are women, but a fair number are men?
Yes, it's utterly fascinating. Women were understood for the most part to be witches because they were understood to be more vulnerable, to be more susceptible to the devil's ministrations. In a very in very hierarchical and I guess very sexist Massachusetts, at the head of those witches is put a wizard, as he was called, a dreadful wizard. And he's, by the end of the summer, as the narrative evolves, he is seen to be in charge of this diabolical conspiracy. But yes, in the end, 15 women and 4 men will hang. And the men are of very different stripes, but our instigator, our mastermind, the diabolical wizard, interestingly, is a Harvard-educated minister. And that too had never happened before in the colonies, that you have a minister who's accused of witchcraft. And there, in terms of where the record is missing, or what we don't know about William Stoughton's beliefs, is another mystery. What exactly was the court's issue with George Burroughs, this poor minister who was said to be such a dreadful wizard? He was clearly a very difficult man. He was clearly an extremely manipulative husband. He had buried several wives, and the women in the community clearly seemed to imply that he had abused his wives in some way. One of his wives had expressed a great deal of terror about living with him, but why he becomes the mastermind here, again, and again, the girls would have known him. One of the accusers had lived in his home, and the others would have known him as the former minister in the community with whom the community was at odds. So again, someone whose name was known, whose reputation was known, and with whom some of the girls anyway, had some familiarity.
I get a bit muddled between the actual trial and the arraignment, or whatever it's called. But are the girls in court during the trial, or is it during the arraignment, and they're sort of suffering fits and so on? What's going on there? And it just seems quite extraordinary that they would be allowed to carry on like that.
It's extraordinary, and I also think, yes, they're in the room is the short answer to your question. It's extraordinary, and yet it also, to me, explains a certain amount, in the sense that it would be difficult to look at these girls and not believe that they were suffering from something. And any number of people seem to say that you couldn't look away. And this was choreographed in such a way where a defendant might make a gesture and the girls would recoil from that gesture in a way that did imply cause and effect, and which would have been extremely difficult, especially if you believed in witchcraft, to deny. There was clearly a certain amount of counterfeiting among the girls. I mean, one girl's hands are tied behind her back, pins sprout occasionally out of their skin. They're often displaying wounds in the courtroom, blood spurts from one's mouth. So there's obviously a certain amount of choreography, at least among some of them, but the presence of witchcraft would have been difficult to deny in a very small room with those girls shrieking and convulsing before you. I think it would have been hard to look away, and it would have been hard to actually hear any of the testimony, which is being interrupted at periodic moments by the girls.
And why does nobody, and perhaps they do make the point, if I'm a witch, why on earth would I be afflicting the girls at this precise moment? You know, when that proves that I'm a witch and is sending me to my death, it seems like the obvious point for the defense.
Yeah, there are so many bits of logic. I mean, at one point, a dog is shot because he's understood to be in the service of the devil, and as one of the ministers will later point out, if that dog was shot, then he couldn't have been a witch because he wouldn't have died. So there are just so many moments where the logic falls down. One of the defendants has the ill fortune to say to one of the magistrates, if I were a witch, you would know it. And that's taken to be a threat. So it actually undermines her case tremendously. It was I think a nightmarish scenario, in the sense that, in a very sort of Kafkaesque way, in the sense that to cast doubt in any way just dug in your guilt further. And I guess the shorter answer to your question is that if you dared to express any skepticism in or out of the court, you generally were rewarded with either a witchcraft accusation, or you were assumed to be guilty. There was really no way of arguing the case. And when you did argue and said something like, "How would I know? How could I be a witch? I don't even know what a witch is," as someone says to one of the early justices, the answer was, "If you don't know what a witch is, how do you know you're not a witch?" Right? The logic here was just unbeatable in many ways. There's a Baptist minister who fairly early on tries to essentially make a case for logic, make a case for sanity prevailing, and he's immediately jailed. And the community is very quick to pick up on this idea that any kind of opposition, any kind of resistance is going to backfire.
So in other words, if you're resisting the trials, you're sympathetic to the devil is probably the best that can be said for you.
I think that the ministers are very good at having emphasized the idea that to deny the existence of witchcraft was to collude with it in some way.
Yeah. So one of the things that runs through the book and runs through the history of the time is these two men, Increase Mather and his son Cotton Mather. And to some extent, in previous years, they've kind of laid the groundwork for a concern about witchcraft. They've written on the subject. Is it worth just saying a bit about these two men?
I think it is, because although they don't explain either from what these symptoms derived or why the court is so hell-bent on prosecution, they completely manipulate the psychology over these months. And really that's the work of Cotton Mather, who's, as you say, is the younger. He's at this point 29 years old. He's the rising hope of the New England ministry. He's utterly brilliant. He seems to turn out sermons and pages while he sleeps. He's eminently quotable, and he's perhaps read too much for his that is right for his own good. But it is his previous book. It is his book, which was a bestseller, about the earlier case in Boston that I think does to some extent infect those first weeks. It does make people assume that if these symptoms are identical, then again, this is witchcraft at work. And he's the person to whom members of the court and various justices will apply for some kind of guidance, because no one has ever seen this kind of epidemic before. There are plenty of moments at which the members of the court really aren't sure of what they're doing, and they need to know on what grounds they are to proceed. And inevitably they go to the Mathers, and particularly to Cotton Mather, who several times will weigh in, always with it took me a while to realize it's always with a nevertheless. In other words, there's always you should proceed with exquisite caution. Nevertheless, we're looking for a strong and vigorous prosecution. You should not, necessarily assume that the touch test is going to help you define witchcraft, but nevertheless, don't deny it. And who does make a case for the justices using spectral evidence, which was evidence, of course, that the accusers could see, but no one else was privy to, which is the one piece of the one sort of fiction on which the court so beautifully turns. It's Cotton Mather, too, who, even after 1692, first of all, continues to believe in witchcraft, but more to the point, doesn't necessarily think that the colony has paid a great price for these 10 months of delusion, because, as he puts it in a piece that he never publishes, but writes privately, God has got disciples. This has filled the pews. The young people are now more religious than ever, and the devil has gained nothing, but pays no attention to the fact that innocent lives have been lost. To his point of view, this has buttressed the faith, and therefore it was a valuable lesson.
And yet, is it not that, I can't remember who said it, but somebody afterwards said that Salem was the rock on which Puritan New England, I can't remember the quote, you probably know the quote, but this was ultimately extremely damaging for the reputation of the Puritans. Is that right?
That's right. It's right. It really opens the door to religious tolerance in New England. It makes it very hard for people to take confession quite so seriously. It sheds there's a certain amount of dubiousness even around some court cases. There are some very feisty Quaker trials that will come up later when an individual basically say, whole juries have essentially, the reputations have foundered because of what those juries decided. You want to be very careful when you're adjudicating a case. But yes, the church will lose a great deal of its hold because of what happens that year.
I'm a lawyer, full disclosure.
An honest man.
An honest man, that's right. First thing we do, let's kill all the lawyers. That's the quote. But it was interesting to me that they don't seem to have had, in the court anyway, they don't seem to have had this idea of the presumption of innocence. And yet after the trials, the elder Mather, Increase Mather, he says that something to the effect that it's better that 10 witches go free than that the blood of one innocent be shed. Although, oddly enough, he then quite quick to say that if he'd been on the jury, he would have convicted the minister you mentioned, George Burroughs. But I think Cotton Mather, well, as you say, do they fall out, the Mathers, over this?
They do a really interesting minuet afterwards, where father and son essentially take slightly different angles on the cases. Increase Mather is clearly more alarmed by what has happened. Cotton Mather embraces it completely. And then they will try to make it seem as if they were basically saying the same thing, which they most distinctly are not. Cotton Mather will, at a time when the governor has, they both actually, at a time when the governor has essentially prohibited any kind of publication about the cases, both of them will publish pieces about the trials. Cotton Mather will appeal to Stoughton to get records from the court so that he can actually write up certain cases to prove, obviously, to the community, but also to posterity. But this has all been done as it should have been. And what's interesting, because of course now we can see it in retrospect, we can see it in context. what's interesting is to see which cases he chooses, whom he writes about, and how he does it. He never mentions any of the extremely eloquent petitions where people in prison say, could you please try us by some evidence other than by what these soi-disant bewitched girls are saying. He never mentions Rebecca Nurse, for example. He mentions George Burroughs, but he never writes George Burroughs' full name. He identifies him only by his initials, as if George Burroughs has some special power, or as if he didn't want to mention the name of a fellow minister. It's very unclear, but he's the only one of the cases where he'll use just the initials. But it's very important to Cotton Mather to get the record out there before anybody could say anything amiss about how the trials had proceeded. And yes, to your point about justices, the judge was meant to basically represent both sides. There's no reasonable doubt. There's no assumption of innocence. Basically, all the bounds we know today of how a court case would be tried were not available in 1692.
You mentioned spectral evidence, which is where the bewitched girls, the afflicted girls, they can see things and they can report that to the court, but nobody else can see it. And then the other evidence they have, which is incredibly powerful, is confessions. There are many, many confessions. And one of the things that's shocking to me anyway is that they seem to have confessed not just because, well, maybe I can get off with because I've learned that if you confess, you get treated more leniently. It almost seems like some of the people confessing believed their confessions.
There's a teenage girl who is accused and when she rides to court, she does so between her minister and her either stepbrother or half-brother. It's unclear which he was. Both of whom are saying to her as they ride along to the court, we know you're a witch. Of course you're a witch. Why don't you confess that you're a witch? And you can see how this impressionable girl being told by, not only her sibling, but also by a man she's meant to respect and feel somewhat in awe of, how she might be convinced by that kind of pressure. A lot of people have trouble separating a guilty conscience from a confession of witchcraft. Very early on, someone says, I heard this voice and it sort of tried to convince me not to go to meeting. And that somehow was construed as, did that mean that on some level I was in league with some diabolical force who was convincing me not to go to meeting? There are an exceptional number of encounters with strange creatures that people see in their homes on the days when they should have been in meeting. So there does seem to be a certain amount of just ambient guilt. And it was fairly easy, I think, since you didn't have the language, to turn that into, I must on some level be trafficking here with evil.
One of your footnotes that you bring up is to a modern case. There's a guy called Ingram's, I think, who works as a policeman. This is a modern case where he's accused of satanic child abuse. And he sort of assumes he must be guilty. So a particular allegation is made, and he says, no, I'm pretty sure I didn't do that, but let me go away and think about it. And he goes away and thinks about it, and he prays, and he ponders, and he says, I actually can remember doing it. And he's completely sincere in his confessions. And he ends up spending, I don't know how many years in jail, long after it's patently clear that it's just nonsense.
We should also say that it's often family members who are accusing you. So very often you're being told this by someone who, first of all, knows you intimately, and second of all, whom you respect. And it's very interesting because you have almost every variation of this. You have, I think the only thing you don't ever have is you don't have a woman who accuses a servant, but you have plenty of servants who accuse their mistresses. You have mothers who accuse daughters. You have daughters who accuse mothers. You have a lot of variations on this. How everyone went back to normal after the trials, after they'd accused each other, is a whole other question. But what's really interesting too is when you hear as the trials are winding down, how a person might have come around to a false confession. And there's one woman, it's like unwinding the imagery. And there's one woman who basically says, well, I said it was 6 months ago that I met the devil because 6 months ago I was basically suffering postpartum depression, although she obviously didn't have those words. And I said that the devil came to me in the form of a cat because a cat crossed the lawn, in front of the barn that day. I mean, you can just see people reaching desperately, trying to make something that some fiction that someone else has supplied for them viable.
Yeah, I think that people who don't understand how psychological pressure works, they think I would never confess, but actually that's just not true. Actually, interestingly enough, I'm not completely sure if this is right, but I read somewhere that one of the places in Europe that saw very little in the way of witchcraft trials was Spain and Portugal, and that's because they had the Inquisition there, and they were very professional and very sophisticated when it came to evidence, because they were chasing down these people who were pretending to be Christians but were actually still Jewish or still Muslims, and so they were very good at weighing evidence because they wanted to get it right. And so when it came to witchcraft, they just looked at the evidence and they said, this is all nonsense. Confessions, what are you talking about? People will confess to anything.
That's fascinating. I mean, it's also true. It also aligns with something else that's so crazy about that year, which is that the more far-fetched the hypothesis, the more it seemed true during that year. The simple solution was never the right answer. The more far-fetched, the more colorful, the more sort of kaleidoscopic, hallucinogenic details you could add, the more likely it seemed.
And one of the characters in the trial I quite liked, and she almost seemed to get through to them, was, I can't remember her name exactly, is it Mary Easty or Mary Esty?
That's right. She's a sister of Rebecca Nurse, exactly.
Do you want to just say a bit about her? Because I thought hers was an interesting case where almost she gets the court on the back foot for almost the first time.
She may be one of the reasons why the trials actually begin to shudder to a halt, in that she files a petition, a very plain petition, which essentially says, could we be tried by if we're going to be tried for witchcraft, could we be tried by some evidence other than what these deluded girls are saying? And could the judge, as he's meant to do, please advocate for us as well as against us? And could we also be tried in a court in an impartial court, not in a court which has already made up its mind? And it's a real plea to, what we today would consider to be a judicial standards. And it does seem to have been read, comes up a couple of times. It does seem to have been read with some attention. It doesn't exactly solve the problem, but it's one of the louder voices we hear in the fall as things begin to devolve a little bit.
Well, okay, maybe we should start to talk about the end of the trials and to the man who brings them to a screeching halt, I guess, which is the governor of the colony, Sir William Phipps, and he's a man with an incredible life story. So do you want to just explain for our listeners where he comes from, what his background is?
He's such he's this sort of swashbuckling kind of huckster of a character who's been fortune hunting for years, and who essentially, to make a very long story short, is made Massachusetts governor because he's a compromise candidate. He's going to make all sides happy.
No. I want to hear about his treasure hunting.
Oh, Gosh, Russell, I'm not sure I remember much about his treasure hunting.
Well, the reason that he becomes influential in England is that he puts together 2 expeditions, one of which mutinies, which he puts down with his bare hands, apparently. And they go off to the West Indies and they find sunken treasure. That's what they're there for. And then they sail back to England and hand over whatever, 70% to the crown. And it's a vast sum of money for the time. And that's when he sort of rises up the classes, but he's still actually an uneducated. Well, I think he was a carpenter. He's now mixing in circles that he's not used to. So they send him off to Massachusetts. I may be shortening the period, I don't know, to become governor. So yeah, I thought, wow, that's a great story.
Certainly not what anyone expected. Exactly. And very much, and this is the crucial piece, obviously, not raised a Puritan, and is not part of the whole Puritan establishment, as much as he knows that he owes his position to the Mathers and to the clergy, which really are working in lockstep with the trial justices. He's something of an odd man out in that company, and he reaches out to the New York ministers, who are a mixed bunch, to ask them what they think of the proceedings in Massachusetts. And that, too, seems to have been a point in the favor of shutting down the court, because what he hears from New York is not that the court has been proceeding as it should have been proceeding. There's a great deal of discussion about spectral evidence, and it seems to have raised some doubts about the court.
I felt reading it, and maybe I was looking somewhere in this horrible, horrible mess. I was kind of looking for a hero. and I felt I'd found it in Phipps.
You just want the fortune hunter to be the hero.
I do. I want it to be a novelistic sense here, and I think you were not so taken with Phipps, perhaps, as I was.
I do think you're right that Phipps is the one who shuts down the court. Phipps is the only person who can actually say to Stoughton, your court will not be meeting again, because Stoughton is still planning the next trials. He's arranging for graves to be dug at the point when Phipps finally shuts down the proceedings. I guess my hero was always Thomas Brattle, and we can argue about which one of us is right. Thomas Brattle is the person who is the 30-ish year old Harvard-educated mathematician who spent some time in London, who anonymously but very succinctly writes up proceedings and essentially says what you see with your eyes closed is not what you see, it's imagination. And says he, in a very respectful way, says, I would rather bite off the fingers of my hands than cast aspersions on these individuals, but something is deeply amiss here. And that pamphlet, which we do not have in its original form, seems to have circulated in the fall and also weighed in Phipps's, was a consideration for Phipps when he's shutting down the court.
Yeah, well, I'm sure Phipps does seem to have been an absolute lad, as they say, in the sense that I think he was not above telling the most frightful lies to make himself appear in the best light. But I also felt quite sorry for him because he's up against this super sophisticated Stoughton.
Well, he writes this. Phipps writes this letter to London, where he basically reports on what's going on and makes it seem as if he hasn't been in Boston. He's just heard of this for the first time, essentially. It's just a tissue of lies, this letter that he writes. He basically says, I've been traveling, which is not true. He just hadn't really thought he needed to report on this earlier, but he reports that he's shutting down the courts, and he gets a yes, that's exactly the right thing to be doing in exchange.
And it is interesting who's not there at the trial, because the Mathers aren't there for the trials, as far as I can tell. They've written these, and I don't understand this, they've written these books about witchcraft. Afterwards, they write about it all. But you don't get the sense that they were physically there, and it's in their backyard. So how on earth is this possible? These two very learned people who are enormously interested in witchcraft, and you think, where else would you be?
I believe that at least one of them is there. I'd actually have to go back and look in the book when Burroughs is tried.
Yes,
Burroughs' execution, in any case, is a very controversial one because Burroughs, that dreadful wizard, the man who's understood to be the mastermind, does something of which witches were said to be incapable, which is to say, just as he's mounting the gallows, he recites the Lord's Prayer, and it was understood that a witch could not recite the Lord's Prayer. And he delivers a very pathetic address, casts some aspersions on witchcraft, and he seems to take everyone seems to be taken aback by what he's just said. There seems to be this kind of shudder through the crowd. And Cotton Mather does everything he can to sort of talk that back. And I'm pretty sure that one of the Mathers anyway was on hand at that moment on his horse.
Yeah. And it's interesting that Increase Mather afterwards says, I'm happy for, to give everybody the benefit of the doubt, but I'm not going to give George Burroughs the benefit of the doubt, or GB as he calls him.
Yeah, I mean, there's clearly some animus among the entire administration against Burroughs. And Burroughs was clearly a fairly unsavory character, but we just don't know what it is that gets turned into his dreadful wizardry.
So the Salem witch trials, they're kind of famous for being used as some sort of, to teach us lessons today. And the famous thing is Arthur Miller's The Crucible, where they're talking about McCarthyite witch hunts for communists. So when you wrote the book and today, do you take any lessons for how they speak to us today?
Well, I think they remain the paradigm for reasons sort of skipping a beat and taking 6 different pieces of evidence and combining them the wrong way. It's shocking to me how susceptible we still seem to be to conspiratorial thinking. I mean, I don't know about you in the UK, but we're still talking about groups of predatory Democrats who, eat babies in pizza parlors. So, yeah. I mean, that just seems to me to align perfectly with precisely what we're talking about. And a significant portion of the population seems able to buy into that kind of thinking. So, unfortunately, I feel as if there's still a large strain of this that remains very vital without the overlay, thank goodness, of a witchcraft court run by William Stoughton.
Yes. Well, there's there's courts that will try you, maybe on even less evidence than Stoughton had. I don't know. I guess what I took from it was, and again, it's a lawyer's point, I suppose, which is that, we have due process rules for very, very good reasons. And as an English judge said, it was one of the last witch trials in England. I think he, in his summing up, said, "There's no law against flying."
Well, it's interesting. There'll be no more witch trials in Massachusetts after Salem. And now that you mention that, I don't think there'll be any more flying either. There's a flying case in Connecticut. That's not true. There's a case in Connecticut, and it's finally determined that it was a little girl and her sister, and they were using a ladder in their flying. So it was revealed to be a false case of flying.
And there was another quote, and I've never been able to track it down since I saw it, but the judge sort of let the defendant go and said she could leave on foot or flying through the air or by what other means was convenient to her. I thought that was great.
That's perfect.
Okay, I think we've. Thank you so much, Stacy. That was absolutely wonderful, and I hope people seek out the book because it is. It's terrific. It's absolutely terrific.
Thank you so much. It was a delight to talk to you, Russell.
Well, that's the end of today's podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, then I have a big favor to ask. I don't look to make any money from the podcast. There's no advertising or anything like that. I just do this because I enjoy speaking to the guests, and I'm keen for them to get as big a audience as possible because I think they are really, really good people. So if you could share it on whatever social media channel you use, tweet it out, whatever it is, and even better if you could leave a review on iTunes, that would be absolutely fantastic. Anyway, goodbye for now.